Tonight on KQED Newsroom, overfishing, climate change, and pollution are robbing our oceans of biodiversity. Our special guest tonight, Alexandra Cousteau, continues her family's legacy of marine conservation with a new initiative to restore ocean health. And what's the long game for Twitter now that Elon Musk has shaken the tech world with his $44 billion planned acquisition of the social media company? We chew on that and the week's other big stories with our panel of reporters. Plus, we crash through the surf with the San Francisco Coast Guard in this week's edition of Something Beautiful. Coming to you from KQED headquarters in San Francisco, this Friday, April 29th, 2022. Hello and welcome to the show. This is KQED Newsroom and I'm Priya David Clemens. This week, the board of San Francisco-based Twitter accepted Elon Musk's bid to buy the company. The billionaire says he wants to take the tech firm private and promote more free speech on the platform. Joining me now is San Francisco Bureau Chief of MarketWatch, Jeremy Owens. Jeremy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Priya.
So this week, after this was announced that he was going to have this planned takeover and it was accepted, Elon Musk went on Twitter, which seems to be one of his natural habitats, and criticized senior Twitter executives, which led to some of Musk's supporters piling on and then criticizing, really harassing those executives as well. It seems like there's a lot of consternation about what Musk's takeover here would mean for public discourse. What are you hearing, and what are you hearing from employees here at Twitter?
Well, I think employees are the same as everybody else that watches Elon on Twitter. They wonder what's truth and what's a troll. And what's his attempt to get people out, right? The free speech rhetoric he's using has seemingly in the recent days brought more right-wing users back to the platform who may have left after Donald Trump had his account taken away, after the New York Post story on Hunter Biden was blocked from being shared. Now that may be a tactic he's using, but nobody really knows. Like trying to figure out Elon Musk's ambitions and what he's trying to do and the meaning behind what he says is a fool's errand for a lot of these. What it creates is uncertainty. And I think a lot of the employees are sitting behind closed doors wondering what's going to happen next. But, you know, Elon gave Twitter's board an option to either endorse his acquisition or just put it to shareholders and not say anything. And they not only endorsed, they unanimously endorsed. And Jack Dorsey, the former chief executive, the co-founder, still on the board, went out on his own and gave a full-throated endorsement of Elon's ownership. I think that's gonna matter within those walls at Twitter. But the fact is, we're not gonna know what Elon's going to do until he gets a hold of Twitter and does it.
This despite the fact that Musk has had several pieces of his business questioned over time, right? There are these lawsuits coming out of the Tesla factory in Fremont that have racial allegations about racist behavior there. He has run many of his companies in this sort of burnout startup culture. He has no filter, and yet there's this full-throated endorsement in large part, it seems, because this deal was so good they kind of couldn't say no.
For sure, he's paying $44 billion for Twitter. That's a lot, especially as we've seen stocks come down in the first quarter and into today. Twitter had an earnings report yesterday that was not great. It was okay, but it does make people wonder how it's going to service all of this debt, right? In this deal, they're larding billions of dollars in debt onto Twitter's books, and Twitter will have to pay for that debt moving forward. Will they be able to make enough profit, especially as he talks about getting rid of the ad-based model, which gets most of their revenue, as he talks about new initiatives that don't always pay off right away, and flat out says he doesn't care about the economics, right? And that's really going to be a question moving forward, and I think is, again, some of the uncertainty that is just resting on the shoulders of Twitter and its employees right now.
Jeremy, in the last few moments we have here, we've had some reports that came out this week. I understand it's called Hell Week in business reporter circles because so many earnings reports come out, and we have had a very serious warning about a major recession coming.
Yeah, Deutsche Bank says that there will be a recession next year. It's the only bank that has really gone that far in saying that. But what we've seen in these earnings reports so far is that the companies, Apple and Facebook and Google, Microsoft, Amazon, the big tech companies that just blew up during the pandemic, right? 2 years of profits we've never seen, profit margins we've never seen. Now they're getting squeezed. And the inflation that consumers felt last year is being felt by companies now. Amazon said that it got $6 billion of extra costs in the first quarter. Apple expects $4 billion to $8 billion of costs in this quarter, right? And so that is eating into those margins. And it's because we put so much into the past 2 years. There was so much government incentive, federal money, Federal Reserve money just flowing into the system. All those are starting to get cut off. All the faucets that have just poured money into the system for the past 2 years, those faucets are getting cut off. And what the effect is on the other side is still a question mark. We saw GDP shrink in the first quarter after growing really well in the fourth quarter. And so there's a lot of uncertainty. I use the word uncertainty a lot, but we've never experienced a global pandemic and this type of government liquidity before.
What comes after it
What comes after it is a real question, yeah.
Jeremy Owens with MarketWatch, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
While Elon Musk's Twitter bid has dominated the headlines this week, his company Tesla is also under scrutiny. A lawsuit filed last week by a black Tesla worker alleges rampant racism at the company's factory in Fremont. It's just the latest in a growing number of discrimination suits against the company, including a civil rights action by the state of California. Joining us now to talk about the new Tesla lawsuit and the week's other top stories are KQED politics and government correspondent Marisa Lagos and KQED supervising senior editor of race and equity Otis Taylor. Thank you both for joining us.
Hey, Priya.
So what do you two think about Elon Musk taking over Twitter? I know you have different viewpoints that you look at these news items from. Otis, let's start with you. What angle are you seeing this news about Tesla through?
Well, what I'm not seeing is talk about black workers, thousands of black workers saying they've been subjected to racial slurs, to racial imagery at factory in Fremont. How can we be talking about someone taking over a social media company without talking about the racism that's going on in his plants? And I feel that Twitter has the potential to become this place where people are being harassed frequently, and then he's going to allow that. He's a free speech absolutist. What does that mean in the public square?
Right. Already when we see on Twitter, like, this is not a place that is always a paragon of high-minded discussion, right? You see women, especially people of color, getting harassed. And I think when you talk about the investigations into Tesla and the way they've denied these allegations, despite over $100 million judgment already against them by one black employee who filed suit, a federal investigation, multiple lawsuits. This is just one of them. And then, you know, sort of coupled with the way Elon Musk has used Twitter historically to often, what it seems like, I think, to critics, sick folks against people that he disagrees with. I think there's real concerns about what this is going to look like moving forward, and about how, you know, he might react to some of these issues that are a lot easier, I think, from the outside looking in. To, you know, I think this is true with Facebook, with Twitter, with everybody. Like, it's okay, get under the hood and then tell us how easy it is to police these situations and to create a free speech, you know, a place where there is free speech, but also respect.
He's also talked to bankers, apparently, when he was looking for the funding, and said, yeah, he'd be willing to cut workers. You know, I'm curious if he would keep Twitter in San Francisco or if he might move it out of state like he did with Tesla's headquarters moving to Texas.
Yeah, I think there are deeper questions there around, like, the lease they have and the tax breaks here and whether that would work.
Exactly.
But certainly, I mean, this is a huge workforce, and I think a lot of people inside Twitter are very nervous both about what you're talking about and then also about the sort of just general direction of the company.
Well, he has said that he might add an edit button to Twitter, and, you know, I got to say, I would appreciate an edit button to my tweets.
Right, but although I think there's also questions about then is there an edit button on the president's tweets, and can people say that they didn't say something? I think, you know, there's always going to be a lot of sides to these types of debates.
Right, and I feel that the platform it's a place where hate speech could reign. I see the way Elon Musk uses Twitter, it reminds me of Reddit and, you know, memification and just putting out anything you want just to stir people up and just say that was a joke. Well, people have been hurt from what has been posted on Twitter. I mean, there are careers, there have been lives that have been destroyed from Twitter postings, and I think we have to be very vigilant about it. But I have to say, he could walk away by paying just $1 billion from this deal.
Right.
Pocket change to him. that should be part of the story too, that someone has that much money and that much power. And I really feel he's making a power move, and he's controlling a very public square of information.
Absolutely. Let's turn to a story this week about people who don't have as much power and don't have influence. This is the care courts story. So hearings have been happening this week about Governor Newsom's proposal to implement care courts to address issues with homelessness. And Marisa, I know you've been following these hearings.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I do think that obviously this is aimed at homelessness, but it's really aimed at the severely mentally ill. And I think that they are trying to make that distinction, because this court could help people who are not homeless. They are estimating between 7,000 and 12,000 people who are, so severely mentally ill that they really can't get treatment themselves. They're not in the position to navigate the process. And that this would be a kind of, it's not a complete conservatorship. It's one step below that. So we had Senator Susan Eggman on Political Breakdown this week talking about this. She's carrying the legislation. And I do think that there's a real effort to try to find an alternative to what's out there. And there are concerns from counties about their ability to provide this treatment. To me, that's the most interesting part of this in a way, is that it actually really holds counties responsible for finding ways to house people, to give them the support they need. And so this is going to be kind of making its way through the process in the coming weeks.
We also heard this week in a few different forums talk about policing and various police actions. There was a state audit that came out that found that there are, in at least 5 agencies, they found evidence of bias among police officers towards people of color, towards women, towards LGBTQ people, towards low-income people. And so we see that coming out. There's also some news, Otis, if you could share with us about OPD and the writer's case and possibly coming out of receivership, and also an LA Times reporter who was targeted by the sheriff in Los Angeles.
Right. Priya, first, before I talk about OPD, I want to make note that this is the 30th anniversary of the police officers who brutally beat Rodney King, the first viral video of police brutality. This is the 30th anniversary of their acquittal. And OPD was under federal monitor for 20 years, 20 of that 30 years. The judge is going to let them out, 1-year probationary period. But I wonder, with what we hear out of LA, with a sheriff targeting a reporter and the audit, it's got to be clear to people that police cannot police the police. We need to have independent auditing of various departments. And while Oakland is getting from under the monitoring, it still has these high disparities of who they stop, who they use force against, and who they arrest.
I would take a moment here to just, make a shout out to KQED's podcast On Our Watch, which I know you worked on, Otis, as well, where they looked at police records of misconduct and really dove deep into this topic.
We're still doing that. Our reporter Suki Lewis is reporting on SB 16, where the transparency law, where police departments have to release their misconduct cases and what misconduct was founded. And you're hearing officers using the N-word. You're hearing officers just take down people for no reason, arresting them for resisting. And then when you look at the body camera footage, this person's saying, please don't hurt me.
And it's important to note this is all happening in concert with an unprecedented spike, at least in the short period, of violent crime and murders. This has happened nationally. So it's not as if our policing system is corrupt but working, right? We have deep problems, and a lot of those have to do with the lack of trust in these communities, the feeling of people who lose family members or who are victims of crime themselves, that they're almost re-victimized by police. So I do think, the LA case is very troubling as somebody in the media, that the sheriff is going after a reporter who reported the news, essentially.
Yes.
And I think that, we have to think about this both collectively but also in the individual basis of these agencies and who is going to hold them to account.
All right, and in LA's case, the day after the sheriff targeted the reporter posted another story where there is someone who says the sheriff lied. I showed the sheriff the video of an officer putting his knee on the neck of a person for more than 3 minutes. And the sheriff lied about that. Police will lie about anything.
Otis Taylor, Marisa Lagos, both with KQED. Thank you both for being here with us today.
A pleasure.
Thank you.
Turning now to the environment. There's a shift emerging in the way environmental advocates and scientists look at protecting the planet. Their stance is evolving from sustainability to regeneration. The concern is that our land and oceans have become so depleted of biodiversity that it's not enough to sustain the status quo. Instead, we need to actively repair the damage we've done and regenerate the Earth. Our next guest has launched a mission to restore the abundance of the oceans by 2050. Alexandra Cousteau is an ocean advocate and explorer, as well as the granddaughter of the underwater cinematographer and scientist Jacques Cousteau. Alexandra, thank you for joining us here in studio today.
Thank you so much for having me, Priya.
We're glad you're here. You're usually in rural France.
That's right. That's right. We went there during the pandemic and loved it so much we decided to stay.
And you're in town because you had a keynote speech last night at the California Academy of Sciences.
Exactly, and it was a wonderful opportunity to see this storied institution that I've heard so much about firsthand, and to be able to share the celebrations with everyone. It was a wonderful experience.
You spoke last night, I was fortunate enough to hear you there, about the need to restore the abundance of our oceans, and you have a mission to get there by 2050. Let's start with a picture of how things are right now. What is the state of our oceans? We hear they're hurting. How bad is the situation?
Well, right now we have lost about half of the blue natural capital that lives in the ocean. So about half of the whales and fish and other life that lived there when my grandfather first started exploring the oceans in the 1950s and 60s are gone. And we're reaching a point where if we don't start turning this around, we could reach tipping points in the next decade from which it will be difficult to come back. And now after COVID, we all know what those tipping points are, those exponential curves. And we don't want to reach those exponential curves in the ocean, because we'll start seeing, different species crashing, and it can have a cascading effect. So what we're looking at Oceans 2050 is how we can take the best available science on regenerating our oceans and turn it into action by 2050, so that in the next decades we can lay the groundwork for that life to cascade upwards rather than crash downwards. And what's exciting for me is that the science tells us that this is possible and shows us how to do it. And we have so many examples of restoration projects from around the world that prove this point.
So let's get to the solutions in a second. What brought us here? Overfishing, pollution, climate change?
Absolutely, all of those things. Climate change, I think, is the one thing that all of my scientist friends are most concerned about, not just because of rising sea levels and changing temperatures, but also changing currents, which many species depend on for nutrient upwellings from the deep ocean that they feed on and that allow them to survive. But we're also seeing increased ocean acidification. And that is not related to climate. That's specifically the carbon emissions that we produce that are being absorbed into the ocean. And the ocean has absorbed 30% of our carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution. Without the oceans, we would be in a completely different situation with climate change. But
it would be far worse.
It would be far worse.
In terms of the heat and the extremes on Earth, on land.
Exactly. But all of those carbon emissions that are being absorbed by the ocean are making the oceans turn more acidic, which can be really problematic for creatures that have limestone in their structures, like plankton, which is the base of the food chain and which produces a lot of the oxygen that we breathe, or coral reefs. Oyster farmers are noticing that acidifying waters make it difficult for oyster larvae to go from a larval stage into the oyster stage, where they build their shells around them, and when they can't build their shell and kind of transition to the next stage of their development, they die. And so oyster farmers are experiencing losses there. So it's something that we're increasingly feel the impact of with climate change. But of course, compounding that, there's pollution, growing number of dead zones around the world. Overfishing is taking a huge toll on our oceans. Many people were able to see what that looks like in the movie Seaspiracy. So it's of concern, and I think that we are quickly reaching the point of no return, but we haven't reached it yet. And that's really important to keep in mind.
I think that is a fear that many people have, that, they look out at the way we as humans have chosen to live our lives, to run our societies. Granted, for a long time we didn't maybe know what we were doing, but we know now. But there's a concern that it's too late.
Yeah.
That at this point, you know, we're on this path. It's a runaway train. There's no way to stop it. You have a different perspective. And tell me a little bit about how that came about.
Well, I think that if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so we have this tendency to want to talk about the things that are catastrophic in our world. And there's a lot of things that are catastrophic happening in our oceans and in our environment, but that's not all that's happening. There's increasing number of people that are focused on rebuilding our oceans, a lot of success stories there, growing momentum in terms of blue carbon and financing oceans. Oceans have typically been at the very bottom of the list of things that are philanthropically funded. And that's a shame because oceans touch on every single sustainable development goal, practically.
One of your signature initiatives is about harnessing the power of seaweed. Could you tell us more about that? That seems like it's really a burgeoning industry.
It is, well, and it's one of those examples of something that we can do that can have an outsized positive impact on these issues. And so our oceans used to be blanketed in ocean forests all around the coastlines, like what we had here in California many decades ago, these beautiful kelp forests that supported a huge amount of life that would go all the way up to Alaska. Of course, in Europe it was the same. All of the coastlines had kelp forests around Australia, Africa. And a lot of those forests have been lost due to pollution, changing temperatures,
as you said, we've seen that here in California.
But the interesting thing is that all of these benefits that these seaweed forests provide, from oxygenation of the water, deacidification of the water, habitat for increased biodiversity, which has a positive impact on fisheries because fish need homes too, and when they have homes they can reproduce, and of course sequestering carbon. And so the ocean really doesn't mind if the seaweed forest is anchored from a rope at the surface or anchored into the substrate underneath. And so that's where seaweed farming is really interesting, because it is really in its infancy here in the West. Of course, in the East, in Asia, they've been doing it for thousands of years, and you can actually see some of the farms from space. But we're seeing a lot of interest, not just in developing new seaweed farms, but also in how we can use seaweed as an industrial feedstock for plastic alternatives and food products and other things. And what we've learned in Oceans 2050's seaweed project, where we've been studying the carbon sequestration potential of seaweed farms, that seaweed farms can sequester exponentially more carbon than we ever anticipated, at times more even than the Amazon rainforest.
Wow.
And so we're using that science to be able to develop a carbon protocol, a voluntary carbon protocol, so that seaweed farmers can be compensated for their stewardship and the services they provide to rebuilding our oceans. And we hope that beyond carbon credits, we'll also be able to start investigating biodiversity credits so that we can start quantifying the benefits and compensating people for those benefits rather than compensating them for exploitation, which has been the model that we've been using for so long.
You certainly have obstacles to overcome. Would you tell us a little bit about what those are and what your vision is for what the ocean can be in 2050?
We do have a lot of obstacles, and I think one of the primary obstacles is this idea that our chief scientist, Carlos Duarte, always talks about, which is the worst thing that we can do for our oceans is to think that it's already too late and to stop trying. You know, the oceans can turn around very quickly. They are extraordinarily resilient, and fisheries can come back, and mangroves and seaweed forests can do their work and help us rebuild marine ecosystems. There's a lot that we can do, and I think what I believe is the most important thing is that we have a shared vision of what we want to accomplish, because in any endeavor to get to a better place, you need a vision of where to go.
And what does that look like in the last minute we have here together? Tell me your vision.
Well, I think that by 2050, it is possible for us to rebuild our oceans, rebuild marine life, and see an increased abundance of whales, an increased abundance of fish, and the expansion of ocean forest, both through farming and through wild restoration. We can see marine protected areas up to 30% globally by 2030. All of these things are possible, and all of these things would help rebuild our oceans to the abundance that my grandfather once knew, and what so many people around the world watched in his films on Saturday nights. I think that that is absolutely possible. And if we come together with that vision in mind, we can make it happen.
A world for your children and mine.
Absolutely.
All of ours. Thank you, Alexandra. I appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you, Priya.
You can learn more about Alexandra Cousteau's work at www.oceans2050.com. Next up, also out on the ocean, the San Francisco Coast Guard often battles the waves and weather in their work to enforce the law, safeguard marine ecosystems, and secure ports. In this week's Something Beautiful, officers practice maneuvers off the shore of Ocean Beach in San Francisco. And that is the dramatic end of our show for tonight. You can find KQED Newsroom online or on Twitter, or email us at knr@kqed.org, and you can reach me on social media at Priya D. Clemens. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you right back here next Friday night. Have a great weekend.